Dear students, dear guests, welcome to our joint seminar, Peace and Conflict at Global Level, Contemporary Issues. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC, Brazil. In this course, we discuss the contemporary tools to conflict management, resolution, and transformation used to promote peace, discussing concrete cases and different perspectives from around the world. We will have guests from different countries and contexts who will contribute with lectures. And in the end of the course, students are going to make projects together. So in both universities, the course will be offered or is being offered to students from different disciplines. In Tübingen as part of the Global Awareness Education in the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and as a free extension course at the Federal University of ABC. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues in Brazil, Al-Hassan Tahiru and me, Glaucia Perez da Silva, from the University of Tübingen. And today we'll have the lecture on ethnic conflicts in Africa, types, patterns, and the debates with Professor Bolaji from Ghana. And I would like to invite my colleague Gilberto Rodrigues to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Professor Glaucia. Hi, everyone. My name is Gilberto Rodrigues. I am Associate Professor at the Federal University of ABC and co-organizer with my colleague Glaucia of this course on peace and conflict at global level. It's our pleasure to have Professor Mohammed Bolaji with us. I would like to introduce Professor Bolaji. He will address the issue of ethnic conflicts in Africa, types, patterns, and debates. Professor Bolaji has an extensive experience in the field of peace and conflict studies. He is an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at the Department of History and Political Science of the Faculty of Social Science and Arts at the Dombo University for Business and Integrated Development Studies in Ghana. He is also the Foundation Dean of the School of Education and Lifelong Learning. He specializes in ethnic and religious conflicts and has published on ethnic and religious conflicts in Ghana and Nigeria in international peer-reviewed journals, such a lot of journals, Professor Hadi, not mentioned all of them, but congratulations for your extensive publications and research. And it's our pleasure to have you here among us. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that charitable introduction. My name is Mohammed Hadi Abdul-Ganiy Bolaji, the Foundation Dean for the School of Education and Lifelong Learning, and an Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the Department of History and Political Science at the SDD-Dombo University of Business and Integrated Development Studies. I'll be speaking on the topic, ethnic conflicts in Africa, types, patterns, and the debates. And what I intend to do in the course of this lecture is to conceptualize ethnic groups, types of ethnic groups and ethnic conflicts. And I'll also explore the causal debates on ethnic conflicts in Africa, particularly the colonial legacy and its connection with every ethnic conflicts in Africa. I will also explore the types of ethnic conflicts in Africa and also look at the consequences of these ethnic conflicts in Africa. And then lastly, I'll look at the required political, institutional, and constitutional imperatives that are needed in managing ethnic conflicts in Africa. I'll draw some conclusion. There are two prominent theories on ethnicity, and these are the primordialist and the constructivist schools. The primordialists see ethnicity as a natural division of humanity. Ethnic identity is natural and ancient, making ethnicity to be widespread and universal. The constructivists see ethnic identities as shapeable and responsive to the socio-cultural environment, thereby making identities to be vulnerable to construction, reconstruction, and mobilization. Both the pre-modernist and the constructivist school agree that there are identity markers that distinguish one ethnic group from others, such as culture, language, clan, religion, community, regional provenance, territory, race, and sometimes physical features, among others. The pre-modernalists believe that these subjective identity markers resulting from shared identity are stable over time, whereas the constructivists contend that these identity markers are not only vulnerable to social construction, but they are also variable. But the two perspectives, the lighter perspective highlight the crucial role that self-identification and what others say play in ethnic mobilization. Therefore, putting the two perspectives together, we can define ethnic identity as a set or a variable set of objective identities markers such as language, religion, and physical appearance that may be largely stable but will succumb to changes eventually. Now, the Minority at Risk project led by Professor Good identifies 6 types of ethnic groups: the ethno-nationalists, indigenous people, ethno-classes, the communal contenders, religious sects, and national minorities. In terms of ethnicity in Africa, there are some nomenclatures that are used. And one is the distinction between majority and minority. The use of this nomenclature first depicts the numerical strength of the group. For example, the Akans and the Dagombes are treated or labeled as majorities in Ghana, whereas the Kusasi and the Grusi are minorities in terms of their numbers. Again, the nomenclature is also used not to depict numerical strength, but to demonstrate political dominance of the group. Therefore, Kokombes, Brifos, even with their numbers, are regarded as minorities because they do not have political capital. In Africa, some ethnic groups are also called indigenous. This is because they have some cultural traits that have lived where they are found for many centuries, and they share collective ancestral ties to the place they are found now. For instance, the Niger Delta of Nigeria has minorities such as the Ijo, Ogoni, Kalibari, and others. In Africa, some groups are also labeled as ethno-nationalists because their political activities lean towards self-determination and greater autonomy. And we can see this in the activities of the Igbos and Yorubas in Nigeria now, because they are frustrated with the sort of federal system that is so highly centralized. And they want a decentralized federalism or even secession sometimes. Now, what is an ethnic conflict? According to Encyclopedia Britannica, undated, It sees an ethnic conflict as a form of conflict in which the objectives of at least one party are defined in ethnic terms, and the conflict, its antecedents, and possible solutions are perceived along ethnic lines. The conflict is usually not about ethnic differences, but over political, economic, social, cultural, and territorial issues. Therefore, ethnic differences are not actually the driving forces for conflicts as the pre-modelists who want us to believe. Thus, ethnic and cultural differences assume salience or importance in polarized political settings. Therefore, our reference here would depict both nonviolent and violent conflicts, and also assume both intra-ethnic and inter-ethnic conflicts. Now, some scholars have explored the causes of ethnic conflicts from two dimensions, notably Michael Edward Brown. The first one is the underlying causes, which may be emerging from religion or unequal distribution of resources, social inequality, and political factors, whereas the proximate causes may be coming from sudden changes in economic conditions or the elite rivalry between ethnic groups, conflict in neighboring areas, and exploitation by the political authorities. It is also important to refer to the seminal work done by Gore about his thesis of relative deprivation, or a group's lack of access to economic opportunities, which can trigger ethnic conflict. Now, part of the causal debate is a thesis on greed and grievances. The thesis has two opposing arguments about the causality of wars and ethnic conflicts in Africa. The greed dimension explains the claim that combatants are inspired to engage in wars because of the economic opportunities and access to resources that the rebellion may open them to. The grievance dimension describes the people rebel over unaddressed historical grievances, inequality, and discrimination. This dichotomy has transformed into a new line of debate that centers on attitudes and conditions. Whereas the attitudes refer to the human individualistic motivations necessary for political mobilization, the latter depict the structural requirements for ethnic conflict. The critical question that needs to be asked is whether both greed and grievances are mutually exclusive, because the individual's decision to better their socioeconomic circumstances may be influenced by the larger group's circumstances. Therefore, it will appear that the bottom line on both sides of the thesis is economic deprivation, while the greed highlights the vertical deprivation, grievances stresses the horizontal deprivation. Some scholars have also found causal factors in some conflicts in Africa, especially those complicated conflicts in the Niger Delta, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, in what they call a resource curse. While resource blessing is also true of some countries, some scholars have argued that there are some causal factors for conflict that are typical of sub-Saharan Africa that correlate with the abundance of natural resources. Such factors are a highly centralized governance structure, uneven power relations between the majorities and the minorities, lack of democracy or political freedom, little or ineffectual government presence in resource-endowed communities, and ineffective political oversight in the extraction of natural resources, corruption, the Dutch disease, among others, as we see in the Niger Delta. Also, on the causal factors, some scholars have drawn the connection between European colonization and ethnic conflicts in Africa. And they contend that the European colonization had a deep implication on Africa and the African people. They particularly cite the disruption of the social structures by ignoring the natural boundaries among the groups and imposing artificial boundaries that have showed the seeds of division among ethnic groups. And one effect of this is that it has made political coalitions difficult, if not impossible, in multi-ethnic states. The British policy that allowed the acephalous groups to be submerged under the centralized political system created a hierarchy of ethnic groups. And this has been the recipe for conflicts in Africa. The British were so excited with the centralized political system because they were also coming from a centralized political system, and therefore created what was known as the warrant chiefs for those groups without chieftaincy. Even where this policy created an unranked ethnic stratification, it facilitated competition between and among groups, which demonstrated a positive connection in both the frequency and intensity of ethnic conflict. The critical question is the colonial influence on ethnicity and ethnic groups so overwhelming that the post-colonial statesmanship cannot address it? Then we'll now look at the different types of ethnic conflict in Africa. And the first one is the autochthonous versus the allochthonous groups. The history of Northern Ghana has been shaped by the conquest of the warring groups, such as the Dagomba, Mamprose, the Nanumba, the Gonjes, over the first settlers, as the Kokomba, the Talensi, the Dagaba, the Nauri, and the Sisal. Assimilation and acculturation have led to a social symbiosis, a sort of power sharing where the autochthonous group are the landowners and the allochthonous groups are the ruling class. However, the power dynamics have not been friendly with the autochthonous group. They, as the landowners, are marginalized when it comes to the use and sale of land. And in the 1970s, when the Ghanaian state's return of land ownership to the traditional owners went to the allochthonous groups rather than the autochthonous group. This has stimulated ethnic conflicts among some groups in Northern Ghana. For example, the Kokomba Nanumba War in 1981, the Gonja Valga War in 1980, the Nauri Gonja War in 1991, 92, and 95, and the Kokomba Dagomba War in 1995. A similar type of ethnic group which occurs in Nigeria is indigenous versus settlers. Now, as a result of trying to let the cosmopolitan nature of the state and local governments reflect in the distribution of public employment, the Nigerian state developed what is called the Federal Character Policy. But unfortunately, this had a boomerang effect by pitting settlers against indigents or vice versa. The policy has created a hierarchy of citizenship where the indigents who hail from a state or a local government are favored against other Nigerians coming from other states or local governments of the Federation. The policy is an affront on the principles of fundamental human rights, where citizens are discriminated against because of their ethnic background. The policy seems to put a premium on group membership rather than the individuals with whom a state has a social contract. Now, another type of ethnic conflict that is widespread in Africa is the chieftaincy conflict. And this is largely intra-conflict. The African states are administered alongside the chieftaincy institution in post-colonial state building with varying constitutional backings. The post-colonial enhanced status of chieftaincy institution, coupled with the commercialization of land to which the chiefs are custodians, has raised the stakes for the institutions to make recruitment and appointment of chiefs very competitive. And this type of conflict is intra-ethnic because the kingdoms or chiefdoms are political reference points for the ethnic groups, since these institutions rest on common ancestry, history of origin, culture, language, and others. Examples are the Dagbon-Nanum conflicts in Ghana and the Owo and Oguta conflicts in Nigeria. The main issues around which succession politics and controversies revolve are succession customs that have remained largely uncodified, and or the committee of kingmakers, around which there are always controversies. We also have communal land disputes, and I want to just cite two examples. One is the Ife Modakeke land dispute in Nigeria, and this dispute involved two Yoruba groups, the Ife and Modakeke people, who claim ownership of Modakeke since the pre-colonial era. Land ownership, with its associated benefits of rent receivables, cultural identity, commercialization of land, was the core issues. And there have been several ethnic clashes in the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial era, which have individually and severally claimed thousands of lives and property. Another example is the Gonja-Nawuri land dispute in Ghana. The Gonja, who are majority ethnic group, and the Nawuri, who are minority ethnic group, claim ownership of the Pandai district in the northern region of Ghana. The Nawuri youth, through awakening the Nawuri ethnic consciousness, has been resisting the Gonja hegemony and their claim over Pandai, which has led to ethnic clashes between the two in 1991, 92, and 95. Another type of ethnic conflict, which is chieftaincy conflict, but this one is not intra-ethnic, but rather inter-ethnic. And this is very complicated, is the Boku chieftaincy conflict in northern Ghana. Two different ethnic groups, the Kusasi and the Maprusi, are in conflict over the chieftaincy of Boku a territory they have been sharing since the pre-colonial times. Both claim allodial ownership of Baku, although most historical narratives contend that the Kusasi were the autochthonous group, whereas the Mamprusi arrived later. Complicated narratives of continuities and discontinuities of intergroup relations that assume ethnic hierarchy confront any objective analysis of their claims to allodial ownership of Baku and chieftaincy, the Baku chieftaincy title. What has complicated this intractable conflict is the fact that from the beginning of party politics in Ghana in the 1940s, both groups have found allies in political parties to promote their bid. Then, another way of seeing the strength of ethnic identity and affiliation is that they have demonstrated this trend in some of the African civil wars. Starting from the Nigerian Civil War, the Igbo ethnic group, due to their experience of religiously motivated murders of about 30,000 Igbos in northern Nigeria in 1966, felt that they wanted to go out of the Nigerian Federation, which was ruled by the Muslim and largely ruled by the Muslim Hausa Fulani. Their attempt to secede led to the Nigerian Civil War, in which 2 million people, both military and civilians, died, largely through starvation. Then in the Sudan Civil War, we also see the strength of ethnic affiliation when the people in Darfur took up arms and accused the Sudanese government of oppressing non-Arab Sudanese in the south while favoring the Sudanese Arabs in the north. In a UN-supervised referendum, 98% voted in favor of secession from Sudan in 2011, birthing South Sudan. Also, in the Chadian Civil War, which started in 2005 and ended in 2010, we see the strength and the importance of ethnic affiliation. The Chadian experience, starting from independence in 1960, there has been an intense struggle for the presidency between the Arab Muslims in the north and the Black Christians in the south. The Sahra's hegemony, who are mostly Christians, that showed in politics and economics, provoked resentment and dissatisfaction among the Sudanic Neolithic Muslims of the north, which led to the civil war in 2005. In the first and second Liberian Civil War, we also see the importance of ethnic identity and affiliation. One of the underlying factors that brought Samuel Doe into politics in 1980 was the fact that the African Liberian identity was excluded from politics that was exclusively under the American Liberians since 1847. Besides that, the Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front employ ethnic polarization and recruitment from Joe and Mano ethnic groups. The government soldiers were largely recruited from the Kran and Madigos. And some scholars have suggested that generally, where ethnic forces are involved, civil wars last longer. This was true of the Liberian case. There are also resource-based conflicts in Africa, And I want to cite the Niger Delta as an example. The Niger Delta is inhabited by various ethnic groups as the Ijaw, Isekri, Ibibio, Ogonin, and others. Nigeria's oil, which contributes about 86% to the government's revenue, is generated in the Niger Delta. Besides that, there is very little to show in terms of development in the Niger Delta community for the wealth that is generated there. Oil exploitation has exposed them to one of the worst environmental degradations in the world. Besides the inter-ethnic conflicts among the groups, wrought by the constructionist agendas of politicians and elites, the people's reaction to oil exploitation has been in the forms of multi-ethnic social movement mobilization, protest, violence, hostage taking of foreign oil workers, oil bunkering, and sabotage, among others. Another form of ethnic conflict in Africa is the herder-farmer conflicts. The herder-farmer conflicts are conflicts over the use of natural resources, issues about grazing versus crop cultivation between the largely Muslim Fulani herders and the largely Christian non-Fulani farmers. This type of conflict is widespread in the Sahel, in Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Ghana, Senegal, Burkina Faso, with more frequency in Nigeria. While these conflicts are constructed around ethnic, religious, cultural, and ideological differences, they are fundamentally contest over control of scarce resources and water resources. Some of the issues involved are the pastoralist grievances of dispossession, pastoralists as surrogate owners, scapegoating with settled dwelling Fulani, the violation of human rights, beating, robbing, raping, and killing of victims, destruction of property, and government inertia to face the cursed men head on. This discussion will be incomplete without discussing the Rwandan genocidal killings, which also has connection with the colonial legacy. The Belgian colonial administration from 1918 favored the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority. The Belgian support empowered the Tutsi to oppress the majority Hutu, creating a legacy of tyranny, tension, and violence. A Hutu revolution from 1959 to 1961 changed the power dynamics of intergroup relationship between the Hutus and the Tutsi, when about 330,000 Tutsi were compelled to flee Rwanda. After Rwanda was declared a republic in 1962, it witnessed a number of ethnic conflicts between the two groups. And then from 1973, Rwanda was under the dictatorship, military dictatorship of Juvenal Habyarimana, which transformed into a quasi-democracy in the 1980s. In order to accommodate the increasing opposition from the Tutsi returnees from Uganda, Habyarimana entered into a power-sharing agreements with the Rwanda Patriotic Front to the chagrin of Hutu extremists. By the end of 1993, there were signs on the wall that a civil war was imminent. However, the international community was was not proactive enough. The assassination of Kabi Arimana, probably by Hutus extremists on 6th April 1994, was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Hutus extremists erected various barricades to identify and kill Tutsi, the process that began the mass killing of Tutsi. Within 100 days, about 800,000 Tutsi had been murdered and 2 million rendered as refugees. It is also important to look at identity-based ethnic conflicts in Africa. By identity-based, we are referring to the creation of us in-group versus them out-group, which is centered on classifying others in and disclassifying others out by employing some shared or assumed attributes such as racial, ethnic, and religious conflict. One of the identity-based conflicts in Africa is religious violence or terrorism. Africa has also witnessed an increase in religious extremism and violence in which the assumed fault line is religion as a shared identity marker. Boko Haram's militant activities in Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, and Al-Shabaab's activities in Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, have largely pitted Muslims against non-Muslims. There are also xenophobic attacks. The failure of post-apartheid South Africa to integrate the Black communities economically has transformed into xenophobic attacks on the Black immigrants, particularly those from the other African states in South Africa. Racial tensions is another example, and one of the paramount challenges of the post-apartheid South Africa is the question of land reforms. The economic freedom fighters' radical stance on land expropriation without compensation is creating some racial tensions between the Black majority, who are about 80%, and the white minority, who are about 8%. Now, I want to look at the consequences of ethnic conflicts in Africa generally. Number one, loss of lives. For instance, about 800,000 people lost their lives in the Rwanda genocide, as cited earlier on. And also 250,000 people lost their lives in the first and second civil wars in Liberia. Additionally, about 2 million people died in the Sudan Civil War. We've also experienced displacement of population. For example, in the wake of Liberian Civil War, about 2.4 million people were internally displaced, while 50,000 Liberians sought asylum outside Liberia. Ethnic conflicts have also contributed to political instability. Ethnic conflicts threaten peace and unity among the various ethnic groups and make integration a nightmarish challenge for state building. Another effect of ethnic conflict is weakening of economic capacities of affected societies, including the destruction of infrastructure and property. Lastly, human rights violations. Many violent ethnic conflicts have been associated with human rights violations such as killing, beating, sexual harassment, and child soldiering. What must be done to arrest the frequency and intensity of ethnic conflicts in Africa? The usual response to violent ethnic conflicts is for the African states to deploy the police and the army to intervene to calm the situation. However, proactive mechanisms are needed to reduce the frequency and intensity of ethnic conflicts. There is the need for political engineering in which a federal or a unitary system that encourages decentralization or guarantees some level of autonomy at the local level, but ensuring a shared government at the national level would significantly reduce political mobilization around ethnicity and the associated effects. Recruitment to the police and the army and other security agencies should reflect the multi-ethnic character of African polities, such that there will not be the domination of one or two ethnic groups in the security agencies. One of the factors that scholars attribute to the failure of the Buhari administration to address the Fulani menace in Nigeria is the dominance of the Hausa Fulani in the security apparatuses in Nigeria, and therefore making them unable to arrest their kinsmen who are the perpetrators of the menace. Now, some political scientists have also suggested some constitutional or political engineering. And there are two models. One model is the constitutional school led by Lichford. And they view ethnicity as an avenue for political mobilization, and they see the articulation of ethnic interests as good for creating political stability and as a way of sustaining democracy. They think that the articulation can curb ethno-nationalist agitations for greater autonomy or even secession. The main features of this approach, as advanced by Lichford, are a grand coalition, mutual veto, proportionality, and segmental autonomy. Examples of where these are used, where these have been used before, are Burundi, Kenya, Nigeria, and Sudan. The second model is the integrationist model, which celebrates some of the modernist assumptions and aims at reducing ethnicity. It believes that creating common citizenship and public space for the citizenry is the surest way to build a liberal society, since it will not institutionalize ethnicity. With this integrationist approach, institutions will not endorse an ethnic form of political mobilization. For example, having seen how ethnicity can wreck state building, the Rwandan state banned 2 Hutu extremist political parties. Examples of states where the integrationist approach has been used are Ghana, Senegal, and Zimbabwe. Whether it is the constitutionalist model or the integrationist model, or both, they need to be constitutional guarantee so that when violated, action can be taken legally. There is also the need for economic management imperative. For African states to manage ethnic tensions, animosity, and violence, they should manage their economies on the path of egalitarianism rather than individualism. An egalitarian system will give equal opportunities to people for income generation, wealth creation, and access to education, health, and other services without recourse to irrelevant entities such as ethnicity, culture, religion, and others. It is when people are discriminated against in accessing these services that they resort to ethnicity and other primordial attachments as survival mechanisms. To conclude, in the course of this presentation, I've conceptualized ethnic groups, types, and ethnic conflicts. I've also examined the causal debates on ethnic conflicts in Africa, particularly the connection between the the colonial legacy and the perpetuation of ethnic conflicts in Africa. I've also looked at different types of ethnic conflict, and I've also interrogated or examined the consequences of ethnic conflicts in Africa. Also, I've also made some recommendations on the need for some political, institutional, and constitutional imperatives to manage ethnic conflicts. What is clear from the foregoing presentation is that ethnicity remains a silent tool for political mobilization in Africa, contrary to one of the assumptions of the modernization theorists that with state building model on the path of modernization, ethnicity and other primordial attachments will die. Rather, ethnicity has been energized for political mobilization in different types of conflicts. Thus, African states must be proactive by putting in place the required political, institutional, economic, and constitutional mechanism that will reduce the strength of ethnicity in politics, thereby paving the way for the socio-economic development of the continent. Thank you. These are the references. Yes, so
Okay.
the question is, what is the future of ethnic conflicts, particularly from the perspective of maintaining the artificial borders created by the colonialists? I think from independence of most African states from the 1960s to now, state building has not done enough to integrate the people in the various African polities because of the strength of ethnic affiliations. If African governments will want to redesign the borders, I think it will create more problems for the African countries. One of the problems will be balkanization of the African states. Now, what is needed is to promote harmonization of the state by giving uniform citizenship to the citizenry. Why ethnic is so potent as a tool for political mobilization is the fact that people are discriminated against. So when people are discriminated against, then they fall back on their group members, their groups, their ethnic groups for survival, for ways. So if African countries can promote union citizenship and also promote egalitarianism, where it will not matter where people are coming from, their religious background, their ethnic background, and they are able to access education, health, and other services without recourse to where they are coming from, ethnicity will reduce. And the issue of integration would also be there. They will be able to integrate. Now, what we've seen, particularly around the borders, in the case of Ghana, where it is coming to electoral campaigns and voting, is disenchantment. The people along the borders, their daily lives is that they shuttle between the two communities, Ghana, Togo. That is their daily life. Some people work in Togo and sleep in Ghana. Others go to school in Ghana and sleep in Togo. But when it comes to politics, you now want to say they are not citizens, then you'll be creating problems. So I think dual citizenship will make sense. And that is what is difficult in Africa to implement. Okay, thank you very much. On the issue of genocide, whether there are other groups in Africa still thinking of doing the same, if I got the question right. And I think if we look at the Rwandan case, which is so popular and very well known to us, we'll see that this conflict emerged from some ancient hatreds that dive into history, and also about the way the Belgian colonial administration supported the Tutsi against the Hutus. There are also other examples elsewhere in Africa. For example, the Gomba Kokomba War in 1994-95. It took the same trend because these people have been politically marginalized, and there is that social stigma that consider them as some sort of people uncivilized and other issues. So this led to people buying arms. Both sides were buying arms, doing that. And we saw just within 20 days, the number of killings, villages that were ransacked and destroyed. From the way we see conflicts in other parts of Africa, we should not rule it out that maybe some groups are not also planning for the same sort of genocidal killing. What we need to do as scholars and governments is to ensure that the distribution of resources are equitable, that governments invest more in services that will bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, so that people will not be able to use ethnic mobilization to achieve their own ambitions. On the issue of resource-based conflicts, I think I cited the issue of the trader-farmer conflicts, which is over scarce resources, arable land for grazing or for cropping. So there are resource-based conflicts in Africa, and I cited the case of the Niger Delta, which is ongoing. We saw in 1985, the way the people mobilized against the states and the sort of killings that went on. And even now, there are agitations, people, the minorities are still mobilizing. It's just that the Nigerian government appears to be overwhelming on them. But we need to take this resource-based conflict seriously if we want to reduce the way people use ethnic identity and affiliation for political mobilization. I wouldn't say the African Union is not working. They are doing their best. It's just that their best is not enough. And what are the problems with the African Union? Politicization at that level is acute. And also, where it comes to ethnic conflicts, there are also protocols, there are treaties that are meant to address ethnic conflicts in Africa. But again, issues about the debates about internal sovereignty, the need to protect each other's states are cropping up and as obstacles in the way the African Union operates. So I wouldn't say they are not working. They are working, but what they are doing is not enough to curtail ethnic conflicts in Africa. And another challenge faced is finances. Many African members, many African states are owing the organization. They do not pay their dues. And before the African Union can address ethnic conflicts, the wherewithal must be there. They must raise the funds, they must set, and you see that in cases of ethnic conflicts, the international community, I mean, the international community outside Africa are even forthcoming than the African Union because of lack of finances to address the ethnic conflicts. Yes, I think the Ugandan president is not alone. Many African countries are also not recognizing the LGBTQ because of the culture of the people, which is more communal than individualistic. And when we go into the human rights debate, we'll realize that some are advocating for relative interpretation of the human rights provisions. And I think these are issues that come up when it comes to the issues about human rights compliance and the way. Even Ghana, there have been attempts to raise the issue at Parliament, and people are just saying, no, it's not part of our culture. There is no need to accept. So in terms of how it will affect social conflict in Africa, I don't see it now, because majority is certainly against it. And they cite the cultural norms as the justification. So I don't see this affecting. It is rather when some governments are trying to impose this on the people. It is when they do that, given the opposition that is coming from the masses, it is then that it can create some social conflict in Africa. But for now, majority are against it. The issue of that some groups receive weapons from outside is also part of the issues we are dealing with in Africa, because the outside world, in one way or the other, also has some interest in Africa, maybe resources, or they are friends to some leaders, and they want to promote their bid by assisting them with weapons. And Also, another example of this is that the Dagon conflict, when the king was killed, it was discovered that some mercenaries from outside were brought in to carry out that. So certainly there are outside influences in ethnic conflicts in Africa. And Africa is not living in isolation of the outside world.
Yeah.
You see that civil wars are very complicated, and there are many causes that can be assigned to them. For example, if we talk of the Liberian Civil War, for example, we cannot tailor it to only ethnic differences or ethnic politics. There are issues about individuals' ambitions. There are issues about development. There are many things. However, ethnic civil wars are avenues for ethnic mobilization. That is the argument we are putting forward here. And we see that clearly in the Liberian Civil War. We see that in the Sudan Civil War and the Nigerian Civil War. So the difference is that one of the ways that people prosecute civil wars, that the elites or the politicians prosecute civil wars, is to use ethnic mobilization as one of the avenues of getting people. And we see that in some of the civil wars in Africa. Now, again, the difference is that ethnic conflict might not necessarily be violent. It could just be tensions, people feeling mistrust, betrayal, and other. So whereas civil wars are violent, sometimes ethnic conflicts may just be tensions without any violence. Now, the issue with dual citizenship, I used that when I was explaining some ways that political elites in some African states used to the citizens to take away citizenship from others, just because they stay around the border. And when you look at their socio-economic life, they live and work in both communities, in both countries. So if you want to use that to say that they do not belong to one country or they belong to another, then dual citizenship, which will recognize the reality of their life, will be a solution. That was what I was saying. If you look at the Nigerian example, there have been complaints by the ethnic groups in Nigeria about the fact that the federalism is highly centralized to the extent that that sort of autonomy, which is granted by the federal system, is not seen by the people. So they've been agitating for a decentralized system. And that is why even before these recent elections, the UBIDS were also agitating to go out of the federalism, to secede. And also the Igbos, since the Civil War in 1967 to 1970, they've been agitating that they want a decentralized system. A sort of, how do they call it? Is a quasi-federal system in which the members will have autonomy at the regional level, and then they will decide what to give to the center in terms of the distribution. Rather now, the central government collects the revenue and decides what to give to the states. They rather want a reverse, whereby the states or the regions would take the receipts, would take the revenue and decide what to give to the center. And that is the sort of decentralized federalism they are looking for in Nigeria. People are looking up to Tinubu to see whether he will be able to redesign the Nigerian Federation in the way that will suit the agitations, the agitators coming from the different ethnic groups. When we talk of the institutionalizing the mechanism, education will play a very crucial role, especially at the grassroots level. Yes, I'm aware that there are initiatives. We have the Center for Civic Education in Ghana, and there are also similar organizations in Nigeria. And they take the issues of citizenship, about election to the grassroots to really educate and enlighten the masses. And I think if we are thinking of institutionalizing the respect for human rights and to reduce ethnicity, I think civic education will play a crucial role. Thank you. Conflict duration, I think I mentioned in my presentation that some scholars have done some work, which is indicating that when you have ethnic identity and ethnic affiliation as an issue in civil wars, for example, you should expect that it will last long. And we've seen another issue that that makes conflict intractable is politicization. And I'm sure you are aware of the Dagon ethnic conflict since the 1940s. And the fact that the conflicting parties have taken political parties. Anytime there is a change of government, it affects the prosecution of the conflict. And for many years, there was no resolution, because if a particular government makes some transformation of the conflict, there will be a reversal by the party that will be succeeded. So politicization is another issue that can let a conflict be intractable. Also, the conflict entrepreneurs. There are some people who benefit from the conflicts, and they will do all they can not to see to it that the conflict is addressed or stopped. And it is the same thing with the outside world, especially if it is to promote their national interest, to sustain the conflict, they will do whatever to do. And someone just mentioned the way people get assistance from outside in terms of weapons. So when you put all these scenarios together, what you expect is for the conflict to last for some time. It will only take a radical approach, just like the NPP did in the case of the Dagon conflict, to yes, resolve it. I still take it as a political settlement. It's not resolved yet, because there are constitutional issues they will need to look at in order to resolve the conflict. What role does the international community play in resolving or addressing ethnic conflicts in Africa? I wouldn't go far, I'll just cite the Dagon ethnic conflict, which started from the 1940s. And there was a brutal resurgence in 2002 when the king was murdered brutally. Now, in terms of the role of the international community, the UN was very involved in bringing the two parties together, educating them on the process of reconciliation and restoration of justice. And they organized numerous workshops for the conflicting parties about the processes of mediation, negotiation, and the last restorative justice. And even when the Kufuor government set up the Committee of Three Eminent Chiefs, their activities were solely, largely sponsored by the UN. So they play very crucial role. We also know about the peacekeeping operations of the UN in the Liberian, Sierra Leone, and others. So they play a very crucial role in addressing ethnic conflicts in Africa. Then the issue of vulnerability of women in ethnic conflicts in Africa. The fact that the socio-economic activities of women are executed around the families and household, they are the first targets of any ethnic conflicts in Africa. And again, the fact that they are nurses and they have their children, childbearing and all that, they are not, they are almost always domestic. Therefore, that situation makes them very vulnerable to ethnic conflicts. What can be done to address the vulnerability of women is that if we want to go, if people will be enlightened that you can engage in dispute while respecting the Geneva Conventions, that you do not attack non-combatants. I think if we go also by some provisions of the Islamic religion, where trees are not to be cut down, the sources of economic livelihood are not, should not be destroyed during wars. And if we can go by the dictates of the Geneva Conventions, I think will reduce the vulnerability of women and children in African ethnic conflicts.